Ardennes, December 1944. Snow hammered the windshield like handfuls of nails. Under me growled a trembling Dodge fuel truck, full of gasoline bound for the front. The radio was silent, headlights taped, breath freezing on the glass. Somewhere ahead waited a narrow wooden bridge, too small for mercy. We weren't allowed to speak. The Germans had sound-ranging microphones in the hills, one squeal from an axle, and the mortars would find us in seconds. But my engine purred like it was wrapped in cloth. No rattle, no screech, just the hiss of snow. I gripped the wheel tighter. Every convoy that passed screamed like a wounded animal through the frost. Ours didn't. And I kept asking myself, why were we silent, when every other truck screamed? Who made that happen? The Ardennes Front. December 1944. They called it the Battle of the Bulge, but to us it was just cold, cold that lived inside the machines, inside our bones. Convoys crawled along ice-choked roads, engines howling like ghosts. We were hauling fuel and ammunition to Patton's Third Army, running lifelines through a dead landscape. Every drum of gasoline, every crate of shells, meant one more day that someone else could fight. But regulations ruled us more tightly than the enemy. The quartermaster's office in Liège had issued a circular that month: all motor vehicles operating under ETO command must use lubricant G301 per spec, tested for moderate climate operations. The ink was neat, the signatures proper. Moderate climate. Whoever wrote it had never felt -20 degrees Celsius crawl into his lungs. At that temperature, G301 turned to marble. Bearings froze. Gears whined until the teeth sheared off like ice glass. Axles shrieked across the hills, each one a flare for German ears. The men joked that you could track an American convoy blindfolded, just listen for the metal screaming. But it wasn't a joke. The enemy had set up sound-ranging microphones all through the ridges. They could find a column within a minute by its pitch alone. The manual said to trust the system, do not tamper with authorized lubricants. Deviations from specification are punishable under Article 104. Command wanted discipline. Reality wanted silence. I'd read those bulletins until I knew them by heart. Paper talked about efficiency and uniformity. Paper didn't talk about trucks burning in the snow because a gearbox screamed too loud. In daylight, we kept the engines idling low, pretending obedience. At night, the road itself seemed to protest, metal groaning, treads clattering, mufflers coughing white breath into the dark. I remember one convoy ahead of us on the Bastogne Road. The sound carried for miles, an orchestra of frozen steel. 20 minutes later, the hills flashed orange. Mortar fire found them, guided by nothing but their own noise. After that, our sergeant ordered absolute silence. No talking. No breaks unless you had to. Every man learned to read hand signals through the windshield glare. Even coughs were swallowed in scarves. But the trucks still screamed. Regulations didn't care. Regulations couldn't hear. And then, somewhere in that endless grind of frost and paperwork, something changed. Our truck, mine, didn't sing the death song. Its axles hummed smooth as water. The steering column no longer moaned. The sound dropped away until all that was left was wind and the slow heartbeat of the motor. It shouldn't have been possible. The G301 inside those casings was the same black stone issued to every driver in the division. Yet somehow, this truck moved like it had forgotten winter. I didn't know it then, but someone had already broken the rules. Someone who understood that on the front line, paper meant nothing if it couldn't turn a wheel. He wasn't a commander or an engineer from Detroit. He wasn't even at the front. He was just a mechanic, a man who believed that machines had souls, and that the regulations choking them were K*ling soldiers faster than bullets. His name was Clarence Miller, 38 years old, farmhand turned army grease monkey. By the time I met him, he'd already earned a reputation in the motor pool, the man who listened to engines like a priest listens to confession. Nobody took him seriously, at least, not until the cold came, and the noise stopped. His name was Clarence Miller, though most called him the quiet man from Oklahoma. 38 years old, built like a fence post, lungs worn out from dust storms and diesel fumes. Before the war, he'd been a mechanic on a wheat farm near Enid, fixing combines and tractors that had already lived 2 lives too long. He could tell the health of an engine by touch alone, fingertips reading vibration the way others read print. He used to say, "Metal breathes, just slower than we do." People laughed. They didn't understand that to him, machinery wasn't lifeless. It was nervous, proud, sometimes stubborn. He believed that if you listened long enough, every part confessed what it needed. He'd left school at 14. When the Dust Bowl stripped the land bare, he rebuilt engines out of junkyard scraps to keep the neighbors' plows running. He mixed kerosene with motor oil when supplies ran short, melted axle grease on the stove just to make it flow in winter. That was his education, necessity. When the draft board examined him in 1942, they rejected him for frontline service. Tuberculosis scarring on his lungs, they said. Limited duty. So they sent him not to fight, but to keep fighters moving. He ended up in the 176th Ordnance Maintenance Company, rear echelon, low glamour, deep responsibility. He never drank, never bragged. He kept to himself, writing home every Sunday in block letters so his mother could read them without her spectacles. I saw one of those letters later, stained with grease. Everything here runs on paperwork. But engines can't read orders. It made me smile, because that was Clarence, plain words, stubborn truth. His tent was always the quietest in the camp. While others played cards or argued over cigarettes, he sat with an engine block under a lamp, head tilted like a doctor listening for a heartbeat. You could hear him mutter under his breath, talking to bolts and bearings like old friends. The younger mechanics teased him for it. "Preach us a sermon, Miller, tell the carburetor to repent." He just smiled, wiped his hands, and went back to work. When the first convoys rolled toward the Ardennes, he was stationed near Spa, Belgium, a frozen depot ringed with pine and mud. There, everything depended on the trucks. Each carried 700 gallons of gasoline or ammunition, and each one howled like a banshee because the standard lubricant, G301, had turned to paste. Bearings ground dry, transmissions screamed. You could hear convoys from miles away. Miller hated that sound. A man should never hear his machine suffer, he told his foreman. He tried reasoning through channels. He wrote a formal request to test a winter-grade mixture, adding a line about field necessity under extreme temperatures. The request came back stamped denied, unauthorized alteration. When that didn't stop him, his lieutenant made it clear in person. "You change that formula again, Miller, you'll lose your rations and your badge. Orders are orders." The others laughed behind his back. One corporal joked, "Next he'll be frying bacon in the gearbox." Clarence didn't reply. He stood by the open hood of a stalled truck, gloved hands resting on cold steel, and listened to the grinding echo fade into the snow. He knew that sound better than language. It meant death waiting down the road. At night, he'd warm his tools over a barrel fire, whispering numbers to himself, ratios, weights, viscosities, trying to calculate something that would make the trucks breathe again. He was no scientist, but he understood the rhythm of metal. It slowed with cold, seized with neglect, obeyed only respect. Once, during a supply halt, I saw him kneel beside a truck's wheel hub, press his ear to it, and close his eyes. Snowflakes settled on his collar. The engine idled steady as if soothed. For the first time, I believed his saying, metal really did breathe. By then, the men had stopped mocking him. Not because they trusted his ideas, but because they'd seen too many friends die in burning trucks, traced by their own noise through the fog. Clarence Miller became a strange comfort, a man who believed silence could be built, engineered, and carried into battle. He didn't know yet that soon, silence would be the difference between life and mortar fire. And that he would have to break every rule written in Washington to give it to us. The repair yard at Spa was a graveyard of engines. Rows of trucks sat half buried in snow, their hoods open like mouths gasping for breath. The wind cut through the canvas tents and rattled the oil drums until they sang like hollow bells. Each morning, we'd thaw carburetors with blowtorches, chip ice from fuel lines, and curse the regulations that had made everything worse. That winter, the grease in every bearing turned to stone. When the engine started, the sound tore through the air, high-pitched, metallic, unbearable. It echoed through the hills like a signal flare. The Germans didn't need spies, they just listened. Their microphones could triangulate a moving convoy by pitch and distance. Every shriek of metal was a beacon, every gear a target. I remember the day Clarence Miller noticed it wasn't just noise, it was warning. He was standing beside a half-frozen Dodge, eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the differential like a doctor feeling for a pulse. The rest of us were complaining about frostbite and bad coffee, but he just listened. After a long while, he said quietly, "They're singing for mercy." We laughed, of course. The phrase sounded mad. But later that night, a supply column left for Bastogne, 37 trucks, all loaded heavy with fuel. The temperature dropped to 20 below. The convoy never made it through the pass. 2 hours later, the hills lit up orange. Mortars had found them, guided by the noise. After that, Miller stopped laughing at anything. He came to the workshop the next morning with a small notebook filled with sketches, axles, gears, lubricant diagrams. "The problem isn't the engines," he told the lieutenant. "It's the grease. It's freezing solid before it can do its job." The lieutenant didn't look up from his clipboard. "Use the issued stock. It's the issued stock that's K*Lingnum." That earned him a long glare. "You think you know better than the Ordnance Department?" Miller didn't answer. He stood there, hat in hand, snow melting off his boots onto the concrete. When the silence stretched too long, the lieutenant sighed and snapped, "Unauthorized alteration. You do that again, you'll lose your badge and your rations." Regulations always sounded clean when spoken indoors. Out in the field, they rusted quick. The rest of us teased him that night. One man said, "What's next, Miller? You gonna butter the bearings?" Another added, "Maybe pray over the crankshaft while you're at it." Miller only gave a faint smile and returned to his cot. I remember hearing the soft click of his lighter, the slow scrape of paper. He was writing again. Probably to his mother. But I saw his eyes that night, and they weren't calm. They were calculating. Over the next days, he ran quiet experiments when no one was watching. He'd take a sample of G301, set it in a tin cup, and leave it outside overnight. In the morning, he'd chip it with a screwdriver until it cracked like ice. Then he'd warm another batch near a lantern and stir in tiny fragments of wax scraped from candles. "Just to see if it keeps its shape," he muttered. He spoke to no one about it, not even me. But I caught him once feeding a spoonful of that mixture into a wheel hub before dawn, gloved fingers moving quick. He wiped the residue off the rim and brushed snow over it. Later, when that truck started, it didn't scream, it whispered. Still, command had its ears everywhere. A sergeant caught wind that Miller was tampering. During roll call he barked loud enough for everyone to hear, "Any man caught altering authorized lubricant will answer to headquarters." That's not ingenuity, that's sabotage. Miller stood motionless, face blank, eyes on the frost creeping across the steel drums. The others shifted uneasily, unsure whether to side with discipline or survival. No one wanted to lose a good mechanic, but no one wanted to be seen near him either. In the army, innovation without permission was the same as defiance. That night, the snow came heavier. Trucks froze solid. A squad spent 3 hours trying to start a generator, its pistons locked halfway through the cycle. The air smelled of burnt fuel and failure. Miller didn't say "I told you so." He just sat beside the dead machine, hands black with grease, breathing slow, as if listening again. He was the first to understand what none of us wanted to admit, that the greatest danger wasn't the Germans. It was the silence between orders and reality. And in that silence, a man like Clarence Miller was already preparing to disobey. It was the 3rd week of December when the order came down, an emergency fuel run through the St. Vith Pass. 40 trucks, each carrying high-octane gasoline, had to reach the forward depots before dawn. Patton's tanks were starving. Without that fuel, the counterattack toward Bastogne would collapse. The temperature that night fell to 25 below. The roads were sheets of glass. Engines howled, transmissions cracked, and every sound carried for miles through the valleys. In weather like that, metal itself became fragile. I remember the look on Miller's face as he read the convoy manifest. He traced the route with his thumb, through the forest, across the frozen river, over a narrow wooden bridge the engineers called the Widow's Crossing. "At this cold," he murmured, "they won't even make it to the bridge." He knew what would happen. With regulation grease, the bearings would seize within 10 miles. The screaming would start, echo off the slopes, and the Germans, listening from the ridges with their sound-ranging microphones, would have the coordinates before the second-mile marker. We all knew it too, but no one said a word. Orders were orders. At 1,600 hours, the supply lieutenant gathered the mechanics in the maintenance bay. He spoke briskly, voice echoing off the corrugated walls. Standard prep, standard issue. No deviations. Every truck will be inspected before departure. Any unapproved materials found, grease, oil, or fuel additives, will be reported to command. A pause, heavy as lead. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, discipline keeps men alive. Miller stood in the back, arms folded, jaw tight. He wasn't the sort to argue in public. But I saw the anger in him, a quiet kind, like heat trapped under snow. That evening, while the rest of us worked on fuel lines and tire chains, he went from truck to truck, running his fingers along the axles, listening. Every rotation gave off the same sharp whine, metal on frozen metal. He closed his eyes. "They're all already dead," he said softly. The war had turned him into a listener, and what he heard now was doom. When the last truck was checked, the lieutenant signed the forms and left for headquarters. The hangar emptied, leaving only the echoes of dripping condensation and the distant pop of rifles from the front. Miller stayed behind, standing under the single yellow bulb that swung in the draft. He looked around, the rows of silent trucks, the drums of G301 lined like coffins against the wall, the thermometer nailed beside the door reading -25°C. His breath rose in slow clouds. Then he muttered to no one, "If I follow the rules, they'll die by the rules." He said it once, quietly, as though testing the weight of the words. Then he set down his gloves and walked toward the tool bench. From my bunk I could see him through the hangar window, a dark figure moving between the trucks. He worked without light, without noise. Only the faint glow of a kerosene lamp near his table gave him away. Every few minutes, he'd pause, staring at some calculation in his notebook, then stir something in a dented tin pail. The smell reached us first, sweet, wrong, almost like breakfast. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't even logical. But Miller wasn't thinking in logic anymore. He was thinking in consequences. He had spent years obeying manuals written for warmer climates, by men who never knelt beside a frozen differential at midnight. Now he was writing his own rulebook. Out there, beyond the trees, men were dying because their machines screamed too loudly. He meant to make them silent. When the watch sergeant came by, I pretended to sleep. Through the frost on the glass I saw Miller pour the contents of the tin, something viscous and pale, into a smaller container. He sealed it tight, marked it with a grease pencil, and tucked it under his coat. By then, the trucks outside were already frosting over. In less than 6 hours, they would start for St. Vith. 40 vehicles. 40 drivers. 40 chances for sound to betray them. Miller looked out into the darkness and said, almost to himself, "One of them has to make it." He turned back toward the benches, where a small stack of paraffin candles burned low. Behind him, the snow kept falling, whispering against the hangar roof. That was the moment the rulebook died. And somewhere between those candles and the cold, Clarence Miller decided that silence was worth any punishment. That night the hangar belonged to him alone. Outside, the snow swallowed every sound, the world muted, as if waiting for his crime. Miller rolled up his sleeves and began to work. His hands were raw, fingertips cracked from cold and solvents, but he moved with the calm precision of a surgeon. On the bench stood a dented pail. Into it he dropped a chunk of lard he'd stolen from the field kitchen, a jar of honey from a care package, and a small can of standard motor oil siphoned from a crate marked Ordnance Property. The mixture hissed faintly as he set the pail over a kerosene flame. The smell that rose was strange, sweet, metallic, faintly alive. He stirred with a length of copper wire, whispering to himself, soft at 30 below, smooth through friction. His mind worked faster than his tongue. The lard melted first, pale ribbons folding into the dark oil. The honey thickened it, binding the mess into something almost human, something that refused to freeze. He tested a smear between his fingers. It clung, supple and warm even in the open air. He smiled once, the kind of small, private smile men give only to proof. "If this works," he said softly, "maybe one truck makes it home." He filled 2 small tins, marking them with no label. Then he walked the line of parked vehicles, boots crunching in snow. The lamps were out, the world existed in grayscale. At the second truck, a Dodge identical to mine, he knelt and opened the hub casing. The metal was so cold it burned his skin through the glove. He worked fast, scraping out the frozen G301, packing in his new mixture with a rag-wrapped finger. He could feel the grease move like blood under pressure. When he finished, he did the same for a second truck, wiping every trace of residue away. To anyone else, they were regulation. To him, they were experiments. By 0300, the pail was empty. He rinsed his hands in melted snow, blew on his fingers until they trembled less, and hid the remaining rag under a broken crate. Before leaving, he turned once to look at the rows of untouched machines, dozens of them waiting for orders that would KLL them. He wanted to save them all. But dawn was coming, and the lieutenant would inspect the line. 2 trucks would have to be enough. He slept less than an hour. When morning call came, we gathered around the engines, stamping our boots for warmth. The air glittered with ice. Someone cursed about the temperature, someone else about his stiff steering. Then came the laughter. "Hey, Miller," one of the drivers called. "You feeding your axles dessert again?" Clarence said nothing. He tightened a bolt, brushed frost off the fuel cap, and nodded to the sergeant. Engines coughed to life one by one, each a shriek of metal agony. But then came the sound that made us all look up. 2 trucks, ours and the one beside it, didn't scream. Their engines purred, low and even, like cloth sliding across silk. The drivers exchanged looks, half fear, half wonder. Sergeant Joe Taylor, the lead of the first column and one of Miller's few friends, walked over. "What did you do to mine?" he asked quietly. Miller shrugged. "Just cleaned the bearings proper." Taylor listened again. Silence, perfect and unnatural. "You cleaned them with something, all right." Miller reached into his pocket and handed him a small tin, its lid dark with soot. "Keep it. If I'm wrong, it won't matter. If I'm right, you'll need it before the bridge." Taylor weighed the tin, glanced toward the lieutenant, and tucked it inside his coat. "If I'm driving to hell, I'd rather go quiet." No one else spoke. The officers shouted the usual checks: tires, convoy spacing, radio silence. Miller stood apart, watching as engines warmed to an even hum. He didn't smile now. He looked tired, older than his years, as if he'd just signed something he couldn't take back. When the order came to roll, Taylor's truck led the line, snow kicking up behind his tires. Miller's breath clouded in the freezing air. For a long time, he just listened. 40 engines, 38 howling, 2 whispering like secrets. He knew what he had done. He also knew he'd done it too late to stop himself. As the last truck disappeared into the white, he wiped his hands on a rag that smelled faintly of honey and smoke, folded it twice, and placed it in his breast pocket. If they came back, he would face the court. If they didn't, there'd be no one left to accuse him. The convoy left Spa at dusk. 40 trucks, headlights hooded with blackout tape, crawling single file into a storm that turned the world to static. Snow blew sideways across the valley, erasing horizon, road, and mercy alike. The only light came from the sky itself, a dim gray glow, reflected through endless flakes. Inside my cab the air reeked of fuel and frost. The wheel trembled under my gloves. Every few seconds I caught the faint echo of other engines behind me, each one shrieking through frozen bearings like an animal caught in a trap. But ahead of me, Taylor's truck moved in silence. Its tail lamps flickered once, then vanished into the storm. We had orders to maintain spacing, 50 yards, no exceptions. Too close and one shell could take 2 trucks. Too far and you'd lose the line entirely. The sergeant had said, "Follow the ghost of the man in front of you." That night, I did exactly that. Taylor's outline became my compass, a faint shadow in the snow. Every mile felt like a confession. The roads were narrow, twisting through pines and ravines. The snow hid the ice beneath. More than once I felt the rear wheels slide, the truck fishtailing before finding grip again. Each jolt threatened to wake the sound monsters in the hills, German ears wired to microphones, waiting for anything louder than the wind. And yet our two trucks, Miller's creations, moved like whispers. No metallic scream. No grinding. Just the low purr of engines breathing evenly in the dark. The rest of the column followed, their noise masking ours. Hours passed. The radio stayed dead. The only human sound was the occasional cough from my co-driver, muffled in his scarf. He finally muttered, "You notice how quiet Taylor's rig is?" "Quieter than death," I said. He nodded once. "If they hear us, they'll drop everything they got." "They won't," I whispered. "Not if we sound like this." At 0200, we reached the Widow's Crossing, a wooden bridge no wider than the trucks themselves. The river below was frozen, black under the moon. Normally, that bridge groaned under weight, the boards flexed and squealed, broadcasting every crossing like a distress call. Tonight, as Taylor eased onto it, the sound was nothing. Not a creak. Not a sigh. Only the wind and the soft patter of snow on canvas. I followed, heart pounding so loud it felt like part of the engine. My headlights swept across the planks, white frost, faint tracks, and silence so complete it felt holy. The truck rolled across as if weightless. Somewhere in the hills, German operators leaned over their oscilloscopes, headphones pressed tight. They were listening for convoys, metal frequencies, mechanical pitches. But their lines stayed flat. The storm hissed, masking everything. One report later found in captured files noted, between 0200 and 0300 hours, all sound readings lost to interference. Possible weather anomaly. We were that anomaly. 2 hours later, a burst of static broke through the radio, command verification code, short and cracked, convoy through. No losses. In the same breath, we heard another message from the northern route. A separate column, 3 miles ahead, had been caught in an ambush. Mortar triangulation based on noise signatures. 20 trucks destroyed. None survived. Taylor's voice came faint over the set, calm as ice. St. Vith Pass clear. Fuel delivery intact. Then silence again. We parked in a grove outside the depot, engines idling low to keep the fuel from freezing. Men stumbled from their cabs, faces gray with exhaustion, eyes reflecting the unreal quiet. Someone laughed weakly, it sounded wrong, out of place. When Taylor climbed down, his coat was stiff with frost. He walked straight to Miller, who'd been waiting at the gate with a clipboard he didn't need. Without a word, Taylor reached into his pocket and held out a spent cartridge case wrapped in torn paper. Miller unfolded it. Inside, scrawled in pencil. "Your ridiculous mix saved an entire column. JT." He read it once, then tucked it away like something fragile. No medals. No speeches. Just silence, the kind that had become our shield. Later that morning, when the sun rose pale and bitter over the Ardennes, the other mechanics came to inspect the trucks. They crouched, scraped the bearings, sniffed the residue. One said, "What the hell is this stuff?" Miller only replied, "A mistake that worked." They didn't know what he meant. None of us did, not yet. But every man there understood that 2 trucks had crossed where 40 should have burned. And somewhere high in the hills, the microphone stayed deaf, buried beneath snow and silence. By dawn, the snow had turned to crystal powder, drifting weightless over the burned ruts of the road. The convoy had made it. All 40 trucks, their cargo intact, not a single man lost. No one spoke of miracles, we were too cold for that, but every driver knew something impossible had happened. In a night when engines froze solid and metal screamed itself to death, 2 trucks had carried the whole column in silence. At the depot, officers moved through the line with clipboards, counting drums, stamping forms, praising discipline. They didn't ask why we were alive. They only asked for receipts. That was the way of things, order over understanding. Miller stood apart from the noise. His coat was unbuttoned, his breath white in the air. Taylor found him behind the refueling pit, warming his hands on a coffee tin filled with embers. Without a word, he handed over the spent cartridge case. It had been polished clean and wrapped in brown paper. On it, scrawled in a stiff, frost-burned hand, were the words, "Your ridiculous mix saved an entire column." J.T. Miller turned the case over once, studying the etching of the brass. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, the way a man's do when proof meets faith. "You shouldn't have written that," he said quietly. "Paper gets people in trouble." Taylor grinned. "Then we'll call it fiction." By noon, command had heard whispers. Rumor moved faster than fuel trucks. "A silent convoy," the officer said. "No acoustic trace." "Impossible." The colonel in charge of logistics ordered an immediate investigation. 2 inspectors from Ordnance arrived by jeep, boots polished, collars high, faces red with disbelief. They gathered the maintenance crew in the hangar, demanded reports, samples, explanations. When they scraped residue from Taylor's wheel hub, the smell of honey filled the air. One officer frowned. "What's this? Sweet?" Miller stood beside him, hands behind his back. "Could be contamination, sir." "Mess kits, maybe." The officer didn't buy it. He packed the sample in wax paper and muttered, "We'll send it to Liège for analysis." Then he fixed Miller with the look of a man who has found a riddle he can't admit to. "You didn't deviate from the lubricant schedule, did you?" "Not knowingly, sir." The answer was half true, which in war counted as faith. When the official report arrived weeks later, it read, "Convoy completed mission with 0 casualties. Acoustic detection, none. Cause, unknown. Weather interference probable. No mention of honey. No mention of Miller." But among the mechanics, the story grew like frost over glass. They called it the quiet run. Some said Miller had mixed whale oil, others claimed beeswax, or the blood of a pig, or some secret compound from Detroit. The guesses multiplied because no one wanted to believe it had been that simple: heat, lard, honey, and defiance. When they came to seize the remaining mixture from his bench, the lab men wore gloves and spoke like undertakers. They labeled the tin, "for study." Miller watched them carry it away. "They'll test it," Taylor said. Miller nodded. "Let them. Without honey, it won't work anyway." That night, after the paperwork was done and the officers gone, he sat outside the hangar door with a cigarette he didn't light. The snow fell soundless, the same as before the run. He pressed the brass cartridge between his fingers, feeling the faint grooves left by the inscription. Around him, engines ticked in the cooling air, hundreds of metal hearts still beating because he had broken a rule. He wasn't proud. Pride didn't belong out there. He just looked down the dark road where the trucks had vanished and said, half to himself, half to the machines, "We gave them silence. That's all." For the rest of the winter, every time a convoy passed through the spa depot, someone would glance toward Miller's bay and lower their voice. His name was never written on an order, never cited in a report. But men who had driven that night remembered. They said he'd taken the sound out of death. And when the war ended, and the last of the fuel trucks went home, there was one grease stain on the hangar floor that no amount of snow or soap could erase, a faint ring, sweet-smelling, like burnt sugar and smoke. After the surrender, the war drained away like thawing snow. Trucks rusted where they'd been parked, engines went quiet for good, and the endless roar of machinery that had filled Europe for 6 years dissolved into the sound of wind through empty hangars. The men scattered, some home, some nowhere. The silence Miller had built became the world's again. He boarded a transport ship out of Le Havre in the spring of 1946. The crossing was calm, gray seas under a gray sky. He didn't talk much. The other soldiers on deck smoked and played cards. Miller leaned against the railing, watching the wake stretch out like a long road he'd never drive again. He kept one thing with him, a small jar sealed with a wax lid, the words, "Ridiculous Fix No. 1, scribbled in fading pencil. Back in Oklahoma, the land waited exactly as he had left it, flat, endless, full of dust and quiet. He rented a shack off Route 81 and hung a wooden sign that read Miller's Garage, engines, tractors, miracles if possible. The first customers were farmers with tired trucks, the kind that coughed when they started. He worked alone, slow, careful, always listening. People said the place smelled strange, part oil, part honey. When asked about it, he'd only nod and say, "Old habit." He kept the jar on a shelf behind the counter, half filled with amber residue hardened by time. Sometimes children asked what it was. He'd tell them it was a souvenir from the war. "We made silence once," he'd add, "and it saved a lot of noise." They didn't understand, but they remembered his tone, calm, deliberate, the voice of someone who had argued with death and won by whispering. Every year he sent a Christmas card to Joe Taylor in Pennsylvania. Never a letter, just a card, and always the same line written inside, "Keep it quiet out there." He never married. His lungs worsened, and he walked slower each winter, but he stayed in the garage until his hands could no longer hold a wrench steady. When the town doctor told him to rest, he said, "Engines rest when they stop breathing. I'm not there yet." Sometimes at dusk, when the light fell through the shop windows and turned the dust gold, you could hear the faint hum of an engine on the test stand, an old Dodge, the same model he'd once driven through the Ardennes. He'd stand beside it, head tilted, listening. If it ran smooth, he'd nod. If it coughed, he'd whisper something to it under his breath until the rhythm steadied. Visitors from the Veterans Administration came once, wanting to record his story for a mechanical innovation archive. They brought cameras and typed notes. Miller sat on an overturned crate and let them talk. When they asked how he'd done it, what he'd mixed, how he'd measured, he only said, the secret wasn't the mix. It was caring enough to listen. The interviewer pressed, asking if it was true he'd broken Army law to save a convoy. Miller smiled faintly. "Law's a fine thing," he said. "But it don't turn in the cold." He refused medals, refused interviews after that. His quiet invention vanished into the footnotes of logistics reports, buried under the grander machinery of victory. Yet among drivers who had crossed those frozen roads, the story survived like a rumor of warmth, the man who fed his trucks breakfast and silenced death. On the day he died, spring had just begun *N. A neighbor found him sitting at his workbench, hands folded, the radio still humming low. The jar labeled Ridiculous Fix No. 1 stood open beside a cup of black coffee. The smell was faint but unmistakable, burnt sugar and metal. At his funeral, a few old mechanics from the war showed up. One placed an empty brass cartridge on the casket, its surface engraved with 3 letters, JT. The pastor spoke of faith, obedience, and order. But those who had driven the frozen roads of Belgium remembered something else, that sometimes salvation comes not from following the rulebook, but from knowing when the rule no longer applies. And on his shelf in that small Oklahoma garage, the jar caught the afternoon light, gleaming like amber, holding inside it the silence that once saved an army. He broke the rules. And saved an army. They laughed at his ridiculous fix, the mix of lard and honey that smelled like breakfast in a world of smoke. But that night, in the frozen Ardennes, it was that scent, the proof of disobedience, that kept 40 trucks invisible. The manual spoke of order. He listened for silence. And when silence answered, men lived. Decades later, a few who still remembered the quiet run said they could never forget the way their truck sounded that night, how the noise vanished, how death passed them by without hearing. They called it luck. Miller called it listening. History forgot his name. Engines did not. In the end, all he'd ever wanted was for the metal to breathe again. And for one impossible night in December 1944, it did.